All right, welcome everybody to another author chat here on the podcast. And today I have the pleasure of chatting with Sam J. Miller. It's really good to see him again. And he is the award winning author of Blackfish City, The Blade Between, The Art of Starving, and more. And his short stories have won and been nominated for numerous awards, have been reprinted in dozens of anthologies. And Sam is also the last in a long line of butchers currently residing in New York City. And his latest releases are the short story collection Boys, Beasts, and Men and the novella Kid Wolf and Kraken Boy, with which both released recently. So welcome back. How you doing, Sam? And congrats on the releases of those.
I'm well, Adrian. Thank you for having me. It's really good to be back, and I'm doing well. It's very weird to have essentially two books drop in 1 month, which is a good problem to have as a writer. Oh no, too much good stuff to talk about. They will hate me on Twitter. So yeah, it's a weird and wonderful moment.
Yeah, but I'm sure you're happy to get on Twitter and just bombard people with your stuff.
I mean, I don't have a problem with it. If somebody else does, they can unfollow me. I won't take it personally.
Yeah, or at least mute. It's fine.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly.
And tell me more about your recent West Coast tour for Boys, Beasts, and Men.
Yeah. So I was really lucky to be able to travel from. I did Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, um, all of which are cities I love, even if I also hate them a little bit, like maybe LA. But to be out on the road, to be traveling again, which I haven't done since 2017, was really special, and it was great to like meet people and see people again and see friends and like have like
Mm-hmm.
complete downtime, disconnected from my life, to like take a 3 hour bike ride through San Francisco's empty,
Beautiful.
abandoned night streets. It was great. It was a really, really good time.
That sounds fantastic. And I imagine like being able to sort of reconnect with readers in a way that you haven't been able to in a long time, just to see them face to face, just because of after everything that's happened with COVID and all that. It's good to just see people in the flesh and be able to like sign a book and say hi and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, it definitely did, and I was talking to an artist friend of mine who's a musician, and we were reflecting, and he helped me to realize that like there's a part of me, and I don't, one is loath to say this or to accept this, but there's a part of me that likes the attention of a crowd,
Yeah.
of a room full of people, and having been disconnected from that for a long time because there were no public events because of COVID. I hadn't realized how much I was missing it. So being able to do events again and to be able to get that kind of like weird crowd energy was pretty great. It's also weird because it's strange times. Book events have never been like massively popular events, and I think that I did some events where it was the first time since March of 2020 that a venue had an event, or that a literary series had an event. So in many places it was like, the crowds were not always. Sometimes they were packed, but sometimes they were pretty empty because people are just not in the habit anymore of going to book events. So it was a little weird, but exciting. And I try very hard not to peg my self-esteem to the popularity of my work. So I don't look at sales numbers, for example. And so I always want to pack the house, but if I don't, I try hard not to like take it personally.
Yeah. And at least your ego got a little bit satiated over the course of your trip. So it's okay.
Exactly.
Oh man! And before we get into things a little bit deeper, I like to ask this question just to kick things off, give listeners and viewers a bit more knowledge about you and your history. But what was it like for you growing up and reading and with SFF and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I've always been unhappy. I was always the kind of kid who was not popular and did not have a ton of friends, and who didn't really like fit in with the people at school, and didn't care about like Top Gun, or whatever the big movies were when I was a little kid,
I
or
mean, you
GI
grew up in
Joe.
Hudson, man. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, books were always my safe place. I love to read. I was
Mm,
always able to like get the stimulation and the imagination that I needed that I couldn't find from the people around me in books. So, and science fiction and fantasy and horror always felt really real to me in a way that like other books don't, which is weird because they're not real. So yeah, science fiction has always been a thing that I think a lot about, that I love, that I read a lot of. My mom is a great writer. She doesn't write science fiction, but she taught me how to like submit stories to magazines when I was 12. I was
oh,
submitting
cool.
from the magazine to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction from the age of 12 until 40. I finally sold
Cool.
my first story there. So yeah, it's always been a part of my life. It's always been something I value. A safe place, an escape, a place where like that my oversized feelings about the world feel like they finally have space to grow.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I feel the same way. It's always been that kind of um, that imaginary zone that you can go to just kind of escape from the bullshit of reality and empathize with people that it might be a little bit more difficult to empathize with people that are picking on you or bullying you or that you don't connect with or you feel a little bit estranged from or what have you. You can just kind of dive into a fantastical science fiction or fantasy world and just be like, oh, these characters feel like people I want to put myself in the shoes of, people that I want to be, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, or when they're terrible people who we hate, that we'll probably watch them die, or otherwise be made to suffer for
And be
their
satisfied by that.
jerkishness. Yeah, exactly.
I'm thinking of Eustace in the Chronicles of Narnia. It's just like, you're a bit of a dick. Don't eat those Turkish delights,
Right,
man.
right. But if you do, it'll be
I
funny.
won't put it against you. Yeah. And for you, just because of your sexuality and everything like that, did you find that fantasy and science fiction were places where you could express yourself a little bit more truthfully?
Um, I don't know. I mean, I think it took me a long time. I knew I was gay from the age of 18. I mean, I knew before then, but I wasn't out to anyone until I was 18. And so I do think that like there's like when you're a writer, when you're a creative artist, right? It can be a struggle to be your true full self in your work, especially if you're from like a marginalized community, or if you're a woman, or whatever. Like if you're anything that's sort of like outside the norm of who historically has been centered in classical storytelling, um,
Hmm.
it's hard to understand that those parts of yourself that aren't that are valuable and that people want to read them and connect with them. So I think that even while I definitely was finding a lot of like freedom and liberation in science fiction, for many aspects of my personality, like the part of me that likes to think that he's kind of smart, or the
Hmm.
part of
Hmm.
myself that's like wants to fight people, which in my real life I don't. But so
Inside my
so
head,
so
always.
exactly. Um, but other pieces of myself, it took me a long time to sort of figure out where they fit into science fiction and fantasy and horror. And I think that just has to do a lot with a lot of things that are personal and like my own growth journey, but also like publishing's growth journey and the character arc
Mm,
of narrative storytelling
yeah.
in the 21st century, right? So like how unwelcoming many spaces were previously to unconventional narrators and folks from marginalized communities, and how that's changing now, and how there's still resistance to it, but it's much more possible. I feel like a lot of writers who 30 years ago might have felt like, oh, it's not safe for me to write the kind of stories that I most want to write, are now feeling
Right.
like I can write those stories and feel good about the chances of them finding an audience.
Hmm. Totally. And for you, you mentioned that you were, with your mom's help, publishing stories at the age of 12, and
Oh no, I
how
didn't
did
say
your
publishing
writing journey
stories. I,
or
I didn't say publishing stories. I
submitting
said
stories
submitting
submitting
stories. I didn't sell a story until I was 18 to like a regional, like a
Hmm.
small press regional anthology of local, of like
Hmm.
Catskill Mountain region writers, upstate. And then I didn't sell another one to a literary magazine until I was like 20. And yeah, so it was like slow going. But
But you had an
that's
early
that's how it
start,
goes.
at least.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
And how did that whole journey start to develop more? It's like you're 18, you get your first published story, and then how did things progress from there? I know you attended Clarion at some point as well. So what was that process like?
Yeah, I mean, I went to uh, after I graduated, I went to college at Rutgers in New Jersey, and then I moved to New York City. And I was always writing, and I was always submitting, and I was always like publishing stories, like you know, very small things in very small places, like a zine that would fold immediately after they published my story, or a
Mhm.
website that would like accept my story and then vanish from the face of the earth. And then some other
It's not your
like
fault, Sam. Don't worry.
no, exactly. I'm totally not the kiss of death. Um, but then like other places that would like get stories that would get anthologized, and so I feel like I was making like very slow but steady progress in terms of like getting my name out
Hmm.
there, getting better as a writer, and being able to connect with people. Um, but it wasn't. I was 33 when I went to Clarion. It was a long time. It was a long
Oh
time of
wow.
like being an adult writer out in the world. I wrote 6 novels nobody wanted. I wrote a ton of stories that didn't sell, and so yeah, I really had to sort of like really come up against like um, how far I had to go. Like you want to one wants to think one is hot shit. One wants to feel like you're really good, and sometimes one is right, but that doesn't mean that one doesn't have a long way to go in terms of like learning. So I had to really sort of come
Exactly.
up against my own limitations and be like, oh, you actually do need to like it was always a point of pride for me that I didn't have an MFA and I didn't take any college classes on creative writing. And so it took me a long time to be like, oh no, it actually is not a bad thing to like study writing, like to learn
Yeah.
how to be a writer, to learn how to get better, and to just have that experience of like collaborating with and getting critique from lots of different writers who are really different from
Mm.
you and can give you a really interesting perspective on your own strengths and weaknesses. So yeah, I totally credit Clarion as like the game changer for me of like what made the difference between like you know the six novels I wrote and failed to sell before 2012, and the 4 novels and a short story collection and a novella that I've published since 2012.
Yeah. And I mean, what was your I completely agree. That's like you should never feel like at any point you put aside the books, put a stop learning, put a stop to workshops or any kind of situation that can help you improve your craft. And I think writers are kind of those people where it's like, for the most part, unless like you say you think you're hot shit and whatever, most people need a bouncing board to be like, okay, I'm not the hottest shit, so there's still more for
Right.
me to learn, and then you can keep applying that to
Totally.
your work. But what was your
Totally.
biggest takeaway from Clarion, and then how do you feel that helped you transition into this stage of Art of Starving, Blackfish City, Lay Between, etc.?
Um, to me, I think the real takeaway, the real like, there were so many insights and things that I learned, but I think the real takeaway that I got at Clarion is that community is a superpower, which is ironic because at that point I had
Mm,
been a community organizer for my day job for almost 10 years.
yeah.
So I knew that community was important, but it wasn't until Clarion that I realized how vital it is to the creative process. Instead, like, yes, community is important. You need to exist in community to like make social change happen, but also you're a better writer when you are like actively involved in community and learning from people and getting critiques for your stories, and things like that. So yes, many little
Mm,
lessons, many moments of things that Clarion gave me. But the big thing was like you're stronger together. You need a team. You need people. And that isn't just true for the
mhm,
6 weeks of Clarion. It's true when you go out into the world and you like are like going to cons and making friends and connecting with people and getting introduced to people, and really like sort of building up that network, especially for folks from marginalized backgrounds who have sort of historically had to like do their own thing because the club wasn't having
Yeah.
them. So yeah, like being able to like meet cool, BIPOC and queer and women writers, and like bigging each other up, and praising each other's work, and shouting them out on Twitter and lifting them up, and sort of getting that kind of community vibe, not only to like help your writing, but also to help your ability to like be a creative person in the world.
Hmm. Yeah, totally. And it's kind of that old adage of a rising tide raises all boats, and it's like if everyone in the community is supporting each other, uh, you know, this book is amazing. I, um, you know, write a quote for the cover of your book, or share it on Twitter, all that kind of stuff. All of that helps so much for these writers, who is like, yeah, the fucking insiders club, who is kind of like
Yeah,
controlling the game in their own sense of whatever that was for such a long time. And now it's like, no, your bubbles burst, and there's the room for all these different people to form new communities, and those communities to intersect, and for everyone to have an opportunity to get the word out there, and just let people pick and choose the books that they want to read, and let authors have more flexibility in who their audiences are. Yeah.
totally.
And then reading your own work, I think for me, it's like reading. You mentioned earlier about just like wanting to fight, even if it's internal. I feel like there's a lot of, call to action, protest, social commentary in your work. Reflections on the world that you see around. Would you say this is true? And if so, it's like, what is writing fiction allow you to do, in terms of, um, viewing what's going on out there in the world, and then figuring out your own way of critiquing it or commenting on it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just like therapy, in the sense of it is really miserable out there. And, you look at the news every day, and you read the paper, and you hear just like each new day a fresh host of atrocities and horrible developments. And so
Mm,
um, I feel like I've come to the place, which again, ironically, for a community organizer who's supposed to believe that change is possible and things can be fixed, like I've just come to a place of like, I don't actually think justice is a thing that exists in the real world. I think it's like a narrative fiction, that we construct to make ourselves feel
mm,
better. Of like, what's the narratively satisfying conclusion to, like, I don't know, an evil president who does all sorts of terrible things, and then retires and gets to live the rest of his life. Like I
yeah.
maybe want that person to like die a horrible death, and they're probably not going to. Or even like thinking about justice on a smaller scale of like, somebody who like murders somebody, and okay, maybe the murderer gets caught, and maybe the murderer gets sentenced, and maybe like the murderer is punished, but like that's not completely justice, right? The people whose loved
Hmm.
ones were murdered don't feel like there's no justice there,
Yeah.
right? That they might feel like, there might be something gratifying about knowing that the guilty person is punished, but
Hmm.
that's not really justice in the sense of like something broken made whole, or the idea that we live in a world where there are rules, and where the guilty are punished and the innocent are saved, kind of thing. So yeah,
Right.
fiction storytelling gives me a way of imagining a world where, like, okay, maybe things are terrible, but maybe things could be okay, and maybe the guilty will be punished, and the planet can
Exactly.
be saved, and the mass extinctions can be stopped, and the far right takeover will be thwarted. All of things I'm increasingly skeptical about happening in the real world. I can write stories about that happening.
I mean, it's kind of ironic that you're in real life. You have this attitude. I wouldn't call it like full blown pessimism or anything, but like skepticism, perhaps. Um, your work very often, I think, as you just mentioned, reflects optimism, in the hopes that you can use fiction, you can use a fictitious framework to, propose like an alternate history in the form of, Kid Wolf and Kraken Boy, or in Blackfish City, despite the dire circumstances and the climate change that have occurred. the lives of many of the people in that book do improve by the end, and there is some sense of like the community is going to come together, and even though things might be open ended, what have you, that there is a sense we could push towards some sort of a better future regardless of the um overall circumstances around us. So I find that to be an interesting uh dichotomy, you know, just the how you view the real world but how you use fiction in that way to sort of push your skepticism aside and question it, at least to use a fictional scenario to provide a little bit more optimism for an otherwise shitty world, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I read Camus' The Plague at an impressionable age, and it's a great book, and there's a lot of really good stuff in there
Hmm.
about like, well, we're doomed, and this doctor is probably going to die. This doctor has the power to like ameliorate suffering. This doctor knows the
Hmm.
limitations of what he can do, and what the consequences might be for himself. And so the question isn't like, am I going to save the world? It's like, can I do the very little that I can? Like, yes, we're all fucked, but
Exactly.
that's not an excuse. Cynicism is not an excuse for inaction, right? It's
Mm.
um,
Hmm.
it's it's a it's a reason to do what you can, even if like what you can, even if you embrace the limitations on what you can do.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. And you know, just getting into Boys, Beasts, and Men, you know, you've been writing short stories for a really long time. At what point did this collection come together in your head? Did you decide I want to put out a collection? And how did that really come together in terms of the sort of, how would you call it? I would say like genre bending sort of style that you present.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I've always wanted a short story collection. I love short stories, and I love short story collections. And I think that the sort of conventional wisdom in publishing is like short story collections don't do well, they don't sell well.
Mm,
Um, and every couple of years, there's like a Carmen Maria Machado's Her Body and Other Parties, or like a short story collection that totally blows that out of the water and exposes that it's
yeah.
bullshit. But they're pretty rare, and so most publishers are they don't want to publish them, and the idea is that they're kind of like vanity projects for the author. So I didn't really think it would happen, and I. Uh, uh, like Tachyon reached out to me, and Tachyon said, "Would you like to
Oh,
do a
cool.
short story collection?" And I was like, "Oh, I kind of would." Like I had never really like given myself permission to think through what that would look like because I didn't
Mm,
think it would happen. Except that I wanted there to be a framing narrative. Like I used to think about like, oh, it's such a cool thing that Ray Bradbury does in The Illustrated
the
Man. It's like
Illustrated
it's a short
Man,
story
yeah.
collection, but like a framing narrative that sort of subsumes them into one master narrative. So I was like, oh, that's a
Mm,
cool trick. I would love to do that. But I didn't think I would be able to. So yeah, Tachyon reached out, and they're just fucking amazing, and they're such a great publisher, and I've had such a great experience working with them. And then once we started, it really sort of like fell into place of like what are the overarching themes of my work? What are the things I keep returning to? What are the stories that I keep sort of like struggling with? And how what's the narrative there? And so there was sort of like an overarching narrative that emerged for me of like, I'm fortunate to be able to like have been really picky. These are less than half of the published short stories that I've written in my
hmm.
life. So I could sort of pick the ones that sort of told a story altogether about like about growing up, and good people struggling to make their way in a bad world, and people sort of like becoming monsters in ways that are amazing or terrible. So yeah, it fell into place pretty quickly. I think once I started to think about, ooh, there's like I'm not the kind of writer who um, like I'm a writer who has things that I keep thinking about, and I always try to be different. I never
Right.
want to repeat myself. I always want to change it up some, but then there's still these sort of like core themes that keep popping up, and so just go with lean into that and find out what the narrative they want to tell is.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you can never completely be satisfied with your exploration of any one thing. So it's like, how can I find new angles to perhaps make my understanding of this a little bit clearer, even if it's just like story by story or book by book or what have you. And I love how that came together and Tachyon gave you the opportunity to do this. And so fucking awesome that you used Illustrated Man as a, I knew after reading this collection, I was just like, yep, framing story. That has to be like an
Yeah.
Illustrated Man kind of inspiration there. And I thought you pulled it off really well in that sense too. But what was it like for you? I'm not sure how many of these stories were published beforehand, and how many were brand new for this collection.
So the framing narrative is original, and then the last story in the
Yeah.
collection has never been published before. And I actually wrote it in 2008, and
Oh wow.
it got rejected by, no joke, 99 places,
Holy
99
crap.
literary journals and science fiction
Wow.
magazines. And so yeah, I really wanted to see this story in print, and I was like, this is the perfect capstone to this collection, the perfect sort of like
Mm,
grace note for the what the rising and falling action of the collection has been. So what the framing narrative and that
yeah.
story are the two that have never been published before.
Nice. I imagine for you it was very like therapeutic to just be like, fuck all of you. I'm putting the story in there. I love it. And it's like, I thought it ended the collection really, really well. But I'm curious for you, how was it in terms of going back through stories that you've written before and then kind of tying them together in a thematic way? Not even that all of them share the same genre, as I mentioned before, because there is so much um, you know, I would say surface level genre wise variety in there. But then once you get into it, it's like the thematic through lines are really strong. So what was it like to pick these different stories? And then how did you go about figuring out like you mentioned this having this like satisfying kind of arc and then conclusion through the course of a short story collection, because I guess it's not as easy to say I've got this novel and here are the 3 acts or the 5 acts or whatever you have, but here are a number of short stories that I have to tie together. What was that process like?
It was mostly just fun. To me they're all coherent, and to me they're all in the same genre, which is Sam is bad at genre. Like like yeah, I know that there are many that were published as horror and many that were published as science fiction or fantasy, and I
Mhm.
get that those are real things in the world that people like, but I'm very bad at it, and I tend to like be mistaken about what the story I'm writing is genre wise. So to
You're
me,
a
they all
sentence
feel
bender
like
and a genre bender.
exactly or breaker, depending on who you ask, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was no struggle there. They all felt really coherent in that sense.
Mm.
It was funny. I took a pretty light touch when I was revising them. Some of them, these span a long time, so I'm a
Yeah.
different writer than I was when I wrote many of them. And as I was like copy editing them and putting them together, I took a pretty light hand. I didn't want to completely rewrite them, even when there were moments where I was like, not so great. But like, some of them that includes stories that like won awards or were nominated for awards or were widely anthologized. So I didn't want there to be like different,
Mhm.
like dramatically different versions of them kicking around.
Yeah.
So I tried to be pretty faithful to it. But then while I was on tour, there were a couple stories that I read because I tried to read different stories in each city, so I didn't get bored. And there were a couple ones where I read the story and I'm like, well, that's not great. That's that's not how I would write that sentence now. I wish I had sort of like paid a little more. I wish I had read them out loud when I was editing them to sort of realize how clunky some of it is and how awkward some of the transitions are from scene to scene. So it was nice in that respect to sort of look back and be like, oh, I've gotten better at some aspects of the craft. There's times where I worry
Mhm.
that like, oh, something vital and powerful in my craft has gone because I'm older and more cynical and jaded, and I'm not as hungry as I used to be. And that's probably true. But it's nice to know that while I have probably lost some things, I have also gained others. So like
Mm.
my prose and my plot beats and a lot of the mechanics of story feel stronger now. But that's just how they
I mean,
feel
that's
for
a
me.
good
I don't
thing.
know.
We were mentioning earlier that by doing Clarion, you're your perception of what it means to critique other people's work or be critiqued and that kind of thing actually helps you to improve as a writer, and it really helps to be able to look back on your own work and be like, shit, that could be better. And I think that's a really good sign, you know? And then
Totally.
even if it is even if you'd already done like a pass, that kind of thing, there are still some things that you can miss. And it's like there are constant opportunities to improve as a creative person. And I'm really curious because I'm writing a novel, but I've never really gotten too much into short stories. But I'm curious from your perspective, what advantages do the short story format have against something like a novel or a novella, just any longer format?
Short stories are the funnest. I just really love them. They're like, you know, it's probably problematic. Here's my short stories versus novels analogy. Right, a novel is like a monogamous, long term, mutually respectful, very special relationship, and short stories are like hookups or one night stands or 1 hour stands, right? They're both wonderful and important, and you can have that all in life. But there's something really satisfying about like a quickie, like a dirty, like, let's do this, let's try something wild and weird, and you're not married to it. You can say goodbye to it when you're done with it. A lot of times if I'm struggling to think through a novel project, I can write a short story that's set in that universe. That's a trick I stole from N.K. Jemisin, who talks about
Nice.
sometimes writing like using short stories as like a test run for a world or a character or a supernatural ability or
Mm.
something. So yeah, I'm like, oh, this idea is interesting, but I might not want to marry it. Let me take it for a spin. So yeah, short stories are fun. They're quick. They're dirty. You can have fun and be in and out quickly. Some people only like one or the other as writers and as readers, and some people like both, and some people like one more than the other. But I like them all
Mhm.
pretty equally. I want it all.
Man, I love this analogy. And you said in and out. You just put the cherry on top of that one night stand of an analogy. Beautiful. Yeah, I think that's actually very interesting. I'd never heard N.K. Jemison's take on it, and now that you mention it, it's like that does seem like a very good um, tool just to be able to like flex a character a little bit, see what the world's like, do some shallow world building, see if it's you know if you can capture you know anyone's attention, even your own, in a short story when it comes to something like world building and character, I think that's probably worth going a little bit further with. Yeah.
Totally.
And then for you, what was it like transitioning into, I guess, your first, is this your first published novella with Kid Wolf and Kraken Boy?
Yeah. Yes, it is. It's the first one that I wrote. Um, and
Woo.
the novella. I mean, like, I actually like it all. Like, there's no writing I've discovered yet that I hate. That's not true. I
Mm.
don't like writing essays. But when it comes to fiction, it's all
Flash fiction.
fun. Yeah, flash fiction I can get down with, but novellas are really fun because they're like okay, if we're gonna keep to the relationship analogy, it's like a summer fling or something
Let's
that's not
go.
a one night stand, but that isn't like, this is going to be a year or more of my life, right? They give you all the things that a novel gives you in terms of like, you know um, the changes, like, multiple plot lines changing over time, action that isn't just like I did this thing and then it's done.
Mm.
So it's a really fun genre, and it's a way to play with plot in a different way, because you want to have good plot beats, but you want to make them fast. It's also just like a really
Yeah.
exciting time now because novellas are sort of an awkward length. And there was a long time where novellas were really important to science fiction, when, like, a lot of the paperback publishers would publish like two novellas in one book, like a mass market paperback that had two novellas in it. And a lot of the pulp magazines and the science fiction journals would publish novellas when those were much more widely read than they are now, and they
Right.
sort of fell out of fashion for a really long time because like the technology and the logistics wasn't there. And it's only in the last few years that I think that we're starting to see like Tor and Rebellion, Solaris, Neon Hemlock is doing amazing stuff. Like there's cool presses
Yeah.
publishing awesome novellas, and that wasn't always the case. It was usually like you would write a novella and you had like one shot. Like if
Exactly.
Asimov's doesn't take it, you might be screwed. So it's nice that there's a lot of places out there now, and I think
Yeah,
we're
completely. Do you
seeing
think
that in terms of all the great novellas coming out now.
do you think that has something to do with ebooks and that whole front?
I'm sure. I'm sure. I mean, many of the places that I mentioned do really beautiful paperbacks of novellas, but I do think that as more and more people read ebooks as like a default thing, it's a pretty easy distribution model. Um, yeah, I think there's you could probably make the case, and I don't do this world, so I don't know. I would imagine that novellas are a less efficient use of bookshelf space, and so they
Mm,
might be less appealing to booksellers because they're small. So
yeah.
who knows? But yes, I do think that
Less
ebook readers have made
visibility.
it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, for me, like ebooks is one of the main reasons that I started reading more, and I think it was Martha Wells' Murder Bot series that really kind of kicked off my fascination with novellas. And you mentioned Solaris before. At what point did the whole Kid Wolf and Kraken Boy thing start? Because I know Solaris has their satellite novella series. Did they approach you about doing a novella, and then how did that all pan out?
No, we pitched to them. My agent pitched it to them, and they
Nice.
bought it. Yeah, I mean, so like the origin story of Kid Wolf and Kraken Boy is actually really is actually like it's 10 years old now. It was actually the one
Oh wow.
story that I wrote at Clarion that I couldn't sell, and it was called Fragments of a. No, it wasn't. Fuck, what was it called? I don't even remember what it was called. Okay, one of two short stories at Clarion that I couldn't sell after Clarion. Anyway, I wrote a story about a world where tattoos give you magical abilities. And it wasn't a very good story. It needed a lot of work. But there's this one like 2 paragraph chunk which sort of sets out the rules of the magic of like the factors that influence the tattoo's magic of like the lineage of the artist, the person who's wearing it, the subject matter, and the context, like the day and time and place that it's inked and what
Mhm.
it's inked with, all that stuff. So those 2 paragraphs, which appear in Kid Wolf and Kraken Boy, have survived for 10 years, bouncing from project to project. I wrote like my first novel, The Art of Starving, we sold in a 2 book deal, and the second book, I originally wanted it to be about teenage boys in love, riding the rails in a sort of like mid mid apocalypse America, and tattoos give
Cool.
magical abilities, and that never
Mhm.
went anywhere. But I did incorporate those paragraphs into the pitch materials that I was developing. It wasn't the direction my editor wanted to go in, and I'm glad because that's how I got Destroy All Monsters, which is behind me somewhere there. So yeah, it's been a long time for those 2 paragraphs and this sort of like world of magical tattoos to see the light of day, um, which is wild and exciting.
Man, that's awesome because though after I read that, okay, so I'm sure anyone listening to this interview knows that I used to be a tattoo artist because I mentioned it a bunch of times and it was a very big part of my life for a long time. Hence all the magic on my arm and all over my body. Those lines, I'm really glad that they survived that whole journey because that was for me, it was like in the context of the story that came around it, as as amazingly cool as this whole like rail hopping adventure in like kind of apocalyptic scenario sounds. Hopefully we get to see that one day because it's a really cool idea. But contextually within this story, I thought that was really just really powerful, very poignant in the sense that, from my perspective as a tattoo artist, I really related to Kraken Boy and his journey as a tattoo artist, and seeing those lines, you know, context and the relationship between an artist and a client is so powerful. And for me, tattooing is such a spiritual experience that I felt you captured it so beautifully there. And lineage is a huge thing too, because there are so many different lineages of tattooing, whether it comes to Japanese or Chinese ink, when it comes to Southeast Asian, Polynesian cultures, you know, even in Western cultures where you have traditional, and then that blossomed out into a whole shitload of different styles and lineages. It's a very, very powerful thing. And I thought you captured that beautifully. And, you know, for you as someone who has tattoos and wrote this story, what do you feel that infusing tattoos with magic gave to your overall representation of Kraken Boy, Kid Wolf, and the world that they live in and experience in, I believe it's 1920s New York?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I will say that those paragraphs were written 5 years before I got my first tattoo. I get one tattoo for every book that I
Yeah,
publish,
that's
and
surprising.
so yeah, so at that point I had not sold anything. So those were pretty abstract, and they had to do with it had to do with sort of this idea that just still really important to me, like that thinking of tattoos not as like a marker of maturation, of like a journey completed, a milestone reached, an achievement unlocked, like something other than like, oh, I had money and I wanted a thing on my body, right? Um,
Exactly.
or,
Yeah.
someone who passed away who was important to you, whatever. Like that, thinking of tattoos as like ways of externalizing our internal experience of the world. And yes, once I did get a tattoo, I was like, oh no, yes, this is magic. This definitely does something. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I do feel like um, I mean, I don't think. Yeah, tattoos are amazing. That's all I can say. And I didn't have any when I conceptualized this, but definitely the form that this ultimate story took is very shaped um, by that experience and that bond, like the bond between your artist and your like. I always get my tattoos from the same artist. Lots of people, I think most people probably get work with more than
Mhm.
one artist, depending. But yeah, I think there's something really special about thinking about like someone who is on a journey as an artist, and you are on a journey as an artist, and you align, and you like, I see this guy once a year, and he puts ink on my body, and I can be like, oh, that's great. We both come a long way in the last year, kind of thing.
Yeah. It's beautiful. I mean, I always liken it to the book that I'm writing right now. There is a character who is a tattoo artist. And so, you know, kind of the mentality that goes behind it is like this serendipitous meeting of two souls who come together and engage in a mutual exchange of pain and pleasure. And the result is something that is both parties, you know? It's like the infusion of the artist and their creativity, as well as the infusion and the body and the skin and the biology of the person who's receiving the tattoo and had the idea to, you know, have this desire to represent something on their body. So yeah, totally agree. And I thought you captured it really well, even though you wrote that before you'd even got a tattoo. That surprises me a lot.
Just those two paragraphs. The rest of it is
Hmm.
post tattoo.
No.
But I'm curious actually because I think about this a lot, right? Because the tattoo artist is an artist, and like I'm an artist, and so I think a lot about my work out in the world of like,
Hmm.
my words in books and on websites and people reading them and discovering them. How is it for you, like, to be an artist whose medium is other people's bodies, and therefore like, things that will be seen by only their lovers, for example, or only their family, or like what's it like being an artist whose work is existing in a world in a way that's just completely like physical, and in many cases hidden or secret or partially hidden.
Yeah, I mean, there's on one hand, there's an intimacy to it. There's this very intense process of, you know, obviously once the design is finished, there's an intense process of the actual tattoo being put onto the skin. And from my part, it's like you mentioned it in the novella, that a tattoo artist has to be engaged in multiple uh you know intellectual and physical fronts at the same time. It's like you have to know like the mechanics of your tattoo machine. You also have to understand the biology of the human body, and the biology of skin and how that works, and how the ink and the pigment gets injected into the skin, how deep you go, all this different kind of stuff. So there is this intensity to it and an intimacy, because you're touching someone's body. And this is something that's really bothered me about tattooing for a long time, is like this intimacy agreement. The engaging in this has given a lot of really sleazy people the opportunity to engage in a lot of really shitty, inappropriate behavior. And for me, that was just like, this person gave you an open invitation to touch their body and put something permanent on their skin and tell their story in a way that for a lot of people is very private. Other people want to show it off, but you know, you kind of like broke a sacred vow from my perspective. It's like if you're
Sure,
entering into
sure.
someone's intimate space, then you kind of fuck that up by making it sleazy and gross and that kind of stuff. And sometimes it even goes like even worse than that. But on the other hand, it's like there's this duality of both magic and burden, where there's a magic in being able to put something permanent on someone's skin, but it's a burden to put it onto their skin permanently. So
Sure.
for me, that meant that there was a lot of forethought going into it in terms of the design process. I never designed anything that was a copy of someone else's work. I never tattooed anything twice unless it was two or more people getting a tattoo as a group. So every single design was unique. Every single design was meant for that specific person, unless they chose a flash design, in which case they attributed their own connection to that artwork. But I did everything possible on my front to make sure that this design is something that I can do in terms of my technical capability and artistic ability. And then once I put it on your skin, I want it to be as unique as possible by not giving it to other people. And so you can do with it what you want after that point. And I'm really happy that you have that healed well and you're excited about it. You can show it off or you can keep it private. But that's kind of part of the journey. It's like at that point, my work is done. You have to heal it. You have to take care of it in the long run. You can show it off however you like. You can, keep it hidden however you like. But yeah, it's this really weird duality between beauty and burden, I think. And it's kind of stressful in a lot of ways. And I think it's underestimated how much like mental health there is in the tattoo industry, especially with
Yeah,
social
I'm
media
sure.
being such a big part of it. That fucked
Sure.
them. That fucked my head more than anything. I think.
I bet.
Yeah. So it was cool for me to read this novella and feel that connection to the character, and knowing that you have tattoos and being able to read so many things where you're just like, you got that spot on. And although you did use gun too many times, people in the tattoo industry, a lot of the time, they're just like, I fucking hate when people call it guns.
Oh, okay.
I don't really care,
Good note.
but I have heard that multiple times. And I'm just like, why do you care so much about it? It's like, that's my tool.
Huh.
I'm like, okay, well, yeah.
Huh. Interesting. I wonder how that looks historically. Like I wonder like I feel like I was writing about a period in
Mm,
which like electronic like the electric tattoo machine was very
mm,
new. And I wonder if
yes.
artists would have thought differently about it then. Like maybe it was cool. Maybe it was cool that it was a gun. I don't know. I'm gonna
Yeah. I
I'll
mean, I
take the
would
note and yeah.
I think because it's like interwar period between World War One and World War Two, there probably would be an association between, here's this like mechanical device in a world where mechanical devices are being invented all the time, and it has a really aggressive sound. And especially older machines, it's like they sound, fucking choppy, like a old cars compared to new cars today. It's like really aggressive in comparison. So I think maybe the association would be there, but that's not something in terms of tattoo history that I've really encountered. But I'm curious, like for you, in terms of, you know the tattooing history of like 1920s New York, but also, just checking out the acknowledgments. You referenced a bunch of like books that you've read, also like in terms of boxing, which is something that your dad was into, and reading books about boxing, but also queer history of New York and that kind of thing. What was your approach to research like for this novella?
I mean, I tend to approach research with a very light touch because I get way too into it. I'll be like, "Oh, I'm so fascinated by this subject that I'm researching that then the story sounds like a Wikipedia entry because I want to put in all the facts
Yeah.
because I'm so fascinated by them." So I often go in
Mm,
pretty loose, and often what I'm going for is just like vibe. Like, what was it? What does it feel like? What are the details that are going to
yeah.
help me convey that feeling? And so yeah, there was a lot. I was able to, like, I did a lot of research. I learned a lot. I tried to put as much of that as I could on the page without getting boring. I didn't like I learned a lot, I think. And not a lot of things, some things that didn't make it onto the page, right? Like, so one of the interesting learnings was just
Hmm.
thinking about the way that like queer identity has changed over time, and how, like, while there have always been queer people, like the idea of like queer as like a identity didn't really look the same, right? And so
Mm,
there was like it was in many ways, especially, and there's a lot of good scholarship about this that I won't that I'll botch, and that I tried to reference in the acknowledgments, but that, like, while it was pretty widespread actually, that a lot of like, you know uh, working class men engaged in sexual activity with other men, and
hmm.
other class men as well. But that it was really common, especially in like places like boxing gyms. There's actually like really interesting scholarship about like, interviews at the time with like people about their sex lives that included a lot of stuff of like hooking up with men, in the teens and 20s. But that didn't like, but that
Hmm.
was not the same thing as like fairies. Like, oh, I'm not, like, what the
Right.
sex that one might have does not determine who you are and how you think about yourself. And so that many men who were like married to women, or had girlfriends or whatever. So yeah, it was interesting. I learned a lot. A lot of it didn't make it onto the page. But it was really interesting and fun, especially thinking about Jewish history, and as a Jewish person,
Yeah.
thinking about like, a sort of point before assimilation, right? Before it was like, so there's this thing that happens over the course of history, where like who is white changes over time, right? And that, many people who today, are sort of like blind, like subsumed under the cloak of white privilege, like people who are Italian, people who are
Hmm.
Irish, people who are Jewish, were not considered white in 1900, right? Or that many people
Yeah.
would not have considered them that, and that many of the sort of like white supremacist, forces were just as anti-Roman Catholic Irish people as they were against African Americans. So thinking about that as like a point in history when like things could have gone differently, and when, like, I feel like for looking at Jewish history in America, I think a lot of it is really focused on assimilation, on trying to be like everybody else, on trying to erase all emblems of difference, trying really hard to prove that we deserve human rights by being just like
Yeah.
everybody else, as opposed to like, really like standing strongly in who we are, and defying the system that denies us human rights and respect. So it was interesting for me to think about, like, what if like a different path had been taken. That was sort of like the seed of what ultimately becomes sort of an alternate history in Kid Wolf and Kraken Boys. Thinking about like, what if we had chosen differently.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it is very interesting that you were able to take various facets of your own identity and your own family history and infuse them into this exploration of what would happen if I engaged New York in the 1920s from the angle of boxing and tattooing and queer identity and Jewish identity and all those different things. And as I mentioned earlier, as we spoke about, to uh, sort of engage with the reality of this world that we call home, and present something, and have a conversation with it, and try and present some kind of optimistic alternative. And you know, it's funny, it's just like in Boys, Beasts and Men, and in Kid Wolf and Kraken Boy, how there is so much, you know, optimism. And you know, even if things are left open ended, in a lot of cases, there's just so much room for uh more positive exploration. And hopefully that's the kind of thing that, you know, from your perspective as a writer, you give these narratives to readers and they can finish a book and hopefully be satisfied, but satisfied to the point where they're like, I'm going to think more about this, and I'm going to think more about this in relation to my own life and my own identity and experiences, and you know, trickle effect of positivity going out into the world. Yeah.
That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm trying for. I might be old and miserable and bitter, but that doesn't mean everyone needs to be. And
Yes.
I want to tell stories that make people think, oh, we're not completely fucked.
Yeah. Yeah. Even though it's like in some days you might wake up and be like, we're fucked. You read Sam
No,
J.
every
Miller's work
day.
and you think, okay.
Yeah. Every day I think
Oh,
that.
Sam.
But also I want to tell
Sam.
stories when, you know, I'm just
Where
looking
things end a little bit more optimistically.
Yeah.
You got to park outside, man. You're okay. You're doing okay.
That's true.
And so just to you know, get back to tattoos for a second. What are the tattoos that you got in relation to releasing books, and what are they?
So every one of my tattoos is an animal from the book that it is
Mm.
commemorated. So I got a killer whale for Blackfish City. Destroy All Monsters has and the main character has an Allosaurus pet, so I got an Allosaurus tattoo. Boys, Beasts, and
Very
Men
cool.
has a short story about King Kong, so I have a King Kong tattoo. My agent I recently sent him the draft of a new novel, and he was like, "You know, Sam, I can tell when you're putting an animal into your book because you want to get a tattoo of it." And I was like, "Yes, yes, you can." So yes, very, very much an animal from each book. I love animals. I want lots of animals all over me. I want to tap into their awesomeness. Um, so yeah,
And infuse your body with their magic. I really like
exactly.
that you have so much meaning behind them, and especially that they're connected to your books. Are you gonna get one for Kid Wolf and Kraken Boy? Are you gonna get a big
You
kraken on
know,
your chest?
I'm not. I'm not. I really thought about it a lot. I don't. I don't think, you know, because the original rule was like one tattoo for every novel. But then like short story collection, because like, you know, I could get one for, like, I love tattoos. I would get one
Yeah.
every day if I could, and I would be out of space really quickly. But so yeah, I had to draw the line somewhere. I felt like short
Okay.
story collection was a fitting creative milestone to
Hmm.
commemorate, but Novella didn't feel like it was quite at that level. So nothing for that for this book.
Ooh, not the summer
But
fling. It's not good enough, man.
no, exactly.
I mean, it would be cool to see you with a giant kraken chest piece, or at least like you could get an octopus somewhere. But I
Well, so
understand.
the problem, Adrian, is that I'm very vain and I love my tattoos and I want people to see them. But also, I'm very self conscious, and so I don't take my shirt off very often, and I almost never wear shorts. So really, the only real estate that like is allowed that works for me is my arms, because I'm not gonna get a neck tattoo.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I'm running out of space. There's only so much arm that I have. Also, my
Yeah.
mother-in-law makes fun of them. She doesn't hate them, but she doesn't love them. So I can't. I don't want to get them like too far down my arm. This is sort of like the cutoff here, so that I
Right.
can like wear
Right.
longer sleeves at the family gatherings. Um, but yeah. So not my chest. I'm gonna have to go to my legs next, and then just like get
Mm.
comfortable wearing shorts.
Yeah, man.
Because I don't want to, like, I could get a bunch on my back, but no one's ever going to see them. So no, I want
But
everyone to
that's
see
part of
them.
what we were talking about earlier. I mean, first of all, props to your mother-in-law for making fun of you as opposed to just like judging you silently or like talking
Yeah,
shit.
yeah,
I like it. I like it
yeah.
when people make fun of my tattoos. I'm just like, good, we can have a conversation about this. Let's
Yes,
go.
exactly.
Yeah. But I think that kind of ties back into what I was saying about my perspective as like a tattoo artist. It's like, you know, I guess it's like you determine your own level of privacy when it comes to your tattoos. And if you're the kind of person that wants to show off your tattoos, then maybe it's like, yeah, you get them in places where they're a little bit more visible and, just like fucking throw out your jeans and go get a pair of shorts, man.
Yeah, yeah. I'm getting there. I'm working on it. I'm a work in progress.
Slowly, slowly. It's all good. We're all works in progress, Sam. It's all good.
Indeed.
All right, man. Well, just to close out, I mean, I really appreciate you chatting with me, but what does the future hold for you as a writer? Now that you've got these two books out, I think you mentioned back in September when we were doing the climate change panel that you were you're working on something to do with like a flooded New York.
I did work on like a sort of like climate change novel that was sort of like a midpoint between here, but the moment that we're in now and the moment of Blackfish City. It's sort of like
Yeah,
mid devastation as opposed to post devastation. And I'm not
yeah,
really that one's sort of like on the back burner for now. Right now, I'm working on like a far future noir thriller about a rent boy framed for murder in outer space, trying to expose the conspiracy and the bounty hunter who's trying to capture him, who is starting to have doubts
very
about
cool.
his guilt. So yeah, it's fun and sexy and wild and dark and thriller-y. So that's what I'm working on now.
That oof, that sounds fucking amazing. I'm 100% on
Thank
board for
you, thank
that.
you.
However it pans out. And if you get back to the flooded New York one, I'd be down to read that as well. So,
I hope that happens.
and just to finish off, what are you currently reading, watching, listening to that you'd like to share with viewers and listeners?
Um, so I'm halfway through season 4 of Stranger Things. I really loved the show for a while. I still like it, and I'm still enjoying it. I'm not quite feeling the spark of like overwhelming excitement that I did initially, and also it kind of feels
Yeah.
like a story that like is being told indefinitely, as opposed to a story that's like
Mm,
building towards a conclusion. Um,
right.
so I can't. I'm not wild about it. I'm really enjoying it. I love those characters, but it's not killing me the way I want. Sorrowland by River Solomon is a book I recently finished
Ooh.
that blew me away. So I highly recommend that. And Summer Suns by Lee Mandello is great, uh, great queer horror. And Poppy Z Bright is I'm digging deep into sort of like the 80s 90s queer horror icons. So Poppy Z Bright is a little retrospective I'm taking right now. I don't listen to podcasts very often, so I don't have any good podcast recommendations if that's what you mean. Music wise,
Music? Hmm.
I am been listening to a lot of jazz. I'm a very late arrival at jazz. It was something I resisted for a really long time, but I'm really loving.
Hmm.
Like I've become a full on John Coltrane convert. So that's quite special.
Yeah.
Santi Gold. Santi Gold is my favorite. My favorite new artist. Her album "Master of My Make Believe" is, I think, the best thing of the past 15 years.
Yeah, it's
So
really
she
good.
has a new album out, which I haven't heard yet, but I love Santi Gold, so I'm excited to check that out. Oh, and the Linda Lindas. I saw Bikini Kill while I was on tour. Bikini Kill is one of like a really special band to me, and they were amazing. But the Linda
Hmm.
Lindas opened up for them, and they're really really fun, really young. Like the drummer's 11. Like I think the oldest person in the band is
What?
16. These like teenage girls who are
Wow.
fucking amazing. So they just put out an album, the Linda Lindas. I highly recommend.
Oh, I need to check that out. That sounds fantastic. And Sam, yeah, once again, thanks for chatting with me, taking the time today.
It's always a pleasure. I'm really happy to chat with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's great to chat with you too. And if you could just let listeners and viewers know where they can find you on social media.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at SentenceBender. I'm on Instagram at sam.j.miller. And my website is
Mhm.
samjmiller.com.
Awesome, fantastic, and yeah, new books, Boys, Beasts, and Men, short story collection, and the novella Kid Wolf and Kraken Boy are out. So those are both really, really awesome. And yeah, I hadn't heard of the Solaris satellite, so I'm gonna go check out the other stuff that they've got going. Sounds like a very
Awesome.
interesting project that they're doing. Yeah, thank you again, Sam.
They
I
do good
appreciate it.
work. Thanks, Adrian. Take care.